Pink Floyd's The Wall. Where do I begin? It's one of the best-selling double albums of all time. It was an influential tour. It was a one-off solo concert. It was a second solo concert tour, and there have been 2 movies made based upon this material. This is not going to be a review of The Wall. Readout Productions is not a channel where we review pop culture. Readout Productions is where we live, preserve, and explore history one step at a time. What the heck does The Wall have to do with any of that? Well, what we're going to do, we are going to explore what inspired the creation of the album, some of the history of how the album was created, and how real-world events have shaped our understanding of this album. There's a lot to cover when it comes to The Wall. A lot of it's very dark, a lot of it's not nice material to cover, but it is history. History is ugly. We have to unwrap it to understand so we do not repeat the mistakes in the past. And this will also be an excuse for me to listen to some fantastic music while I'm editing and get demonetized and copyright strike for using copyright music, for talking about sensitive material. Wait, why am I doing this again? Well, without any further ado, we are going to explore the history behind Pink Floyd's The Wall. January 22nd, 1944, Allied Command gave the go-ahead to commence Operation Shingle. This was a strategy to break through the German defenses in Italy. Now, in 1943, the Allied forces had taken Sicily, then landed on the southern boot of Italy, but were being blocked that winter by the Guesdon line. They could not get to Rome by land, so why not try by sea? Operation Shingle called for an amphibious landing to outflank the Germans, landing at a place known as Anzio, and then would move their way inland, completely compromising the German lines. At least that was the plan. Amongst those that would make landings at Anzio was 2nd Lieutenant Eric Fletcher Waters, Company Z of the 8th Battalion of Royal Fusiliers. Now, Waters had not expected to find himself on a beachhead with a rifle in hand commanding troops. In fact, when the Second World War began, he was a conscientious objector, in part due to his Christian faith, but also he had lost his father, George Henry Waters, who had served as a sapper in the Somme offensive. He was killed in September of 1916, and understandably, Mr. Waters did not want to follow in his father's footsteps. Originally, he operated ambulances for the British forces, but as the war progressed, he grew increasingly anti-fascist. In fact, he changed his political allegiance from the Labour Party to the British Communist Party and decided to go fight against the Germans man-to-man out in the battlefield. This brings us to mid-February of 1944. The Allies had initially had good success getting the beachhead established at Anzio, and it moved about a dozen miles inland, but starting actually in late January, the Germans began several counteroffensives, the largest of which began on February 16th. Over 70,000 German soldiers were facing off against 40,000 Allied forces, and the idea was to drive the Allied forces back into the sea. What had ended up happening was Waters' force was located near a small community called Aprilia, which the Brits had dubbed the factory due to the church towers they can see on the horizon, giving the village the look of a factory that they would have saw back in London. They held tenaciously to Aprilia, but unfortunately, the 8th Battalion were on the very extreme flank of the British 56th Division. Everything to the right of this division was the American sector, and the Germans looked to exploit that. They succeeded in getting scores of tanks and men between the 56th Division and the American sector, starting to isolate the 8th Battalion of Royal Fusiliers. Now, they held off for several days, and it wasn't just Company Z. We also know of Company X and Y. In fact, in the evening of February 17th, Company X and Y, what was left of them, was ordered to evacuate Aprilia, while Company Z would cover the retreat. German forces, however, caught up too quickly, blocked the route of escape for Company Z, And sometime in the morning of February 18th, 1944, Mr. Waters was killed in action. His remains were never recovered. Eric Fletcher Waters would leave behind a wife named Mary and 2 children, the youngest of which, Roger, was just 5 months old.
Oh, for f***'s sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming. I'm trying to sing a song.
It's July 6, 1977, Montreal's Olympic Stadium. Over 80,000 people are packed in to listen to one of the hottest acts in rock music, Pink Floyd. Unfortunately for the band, and especially for their bassist, it is not a good night. In fact, it's not been a good tour overall. A little backtracking here. Pink Floyd was founded in the mid-1960s and originally consisted of the lineup of bassist Roger Waters, drummer Nick Mason, keyboardist Richard Wright, and guitarist Syd Barrett. Now, Syd Barrett was also lead vocals and one of the key writers behind the scenes for their songs. Now, after the release of their first album, the band had pretty good success early on, but Barrett was not able to handle newfound popularity and as such suffered a mental breakdown. Barrett left the band and was replaced by David Gilmour, who took up the mantle of guitarist and being typically lead vocals. After this change of lineup, the band was unsure where to go. Under Barrett, they were known as a space rock band. It took a few albums, but in 1973, they hit gold with Dark Side of the Moon, an album that explored the ideas of madness. That was followed up by Wish You Were Here in 1975, which examined the perils of the music industry and also explored what had led to Syd Barrett's breakdown. And then in 1977 came Animals, which was an ode to George Orwell and an investigation into the class system found both predominantly in England but around the world as well. And on July 6, 1977, they were wrapping up their tour to promote Animals. The tour was actually dubbed In the Flesh, and that'll be important for later. But this tour had not gone well at all. There were multiple technical issues, and Roger Waters in particular is having a rough time. He had contracted hepatitis and had not realized it. And at an earlier show in Philadelphia, a quack doctor had jacked him up on some type of drug to get rid of what he thought was food poisoning, and he endured what he described as the longest 2 hours of his life. Everything reached a disastrous crescendo in Montreal. Pink Floyd was not used to performing in these big stadiums. They liked small ambient atmospheres where everybody can hear every last drop of music spewing from their guitars, their drums, their pianos. Not giant football fields where you can only see peanuts on the stage. Nevertheless, it made money, so they would be pressed to play these larger stadiums. And Montreal Stadium was one of the largest in Canada, had to offer. They actually had to open the stadium around 2 in the afternoon and start allowing people in, which meant there were a lot of people hanging around, not a lot to do. And what do you think teenagers are going to do when they get bored? They're going to start drinking, maybe not do some illegal drugs, and if they brought in some fireworks, they're going to set them off to entertain themselves. In fact, before the concert began, some drunken spectator had gotten to the rim of the stadium and was precariously wobbling around. Security managed to get him down. Initially, the concert went fine, but firecrackers were being set off. It seemed the crowd was generally disinterested, and Roger Waters finally let loose his rage. Waters was not really vocal on stage. Although he was one of the leading writers behind the scenes, he'd like to keep quiet on stage. But his pent-up frustration from the whole tour let loose, and in one particular shocking incident, a fan threw firecrackers at the base of his microphone. Waters proceeded to grab a bottle of beer, down it, and spat on that fan. After 2 encores, which the band were not happy with, the crowd demanded a third one. David Gilmour wanted no part of it and walked off the stage up into the crowd, requiring Snowy White, another guitarist, to finish the set. It was a complete disaster, and after this agonizing experience, Roger Waters wanted to build a wall between himself and the crowd. In 1978, Roger Waters produced a demo tape labeled Bricks in the Wall, exploring through song the troubled life of rock star Pink, who attempts to isolate himself from human interaction. Traumatic events, including the death of his father in the Second World War, an overbearing mother, an abusive schoolteacher, and a disintegrating marriage, are symbolized as bricks in a metaphorical wall between Pink and the rest of the world. It is only when Pink admits remaining isolated becomes more destructive for himself and those around him that he finally tears down his wall. The concept is influenced both by Roger Waters' childhood and failing marriage at the time, as well as the mental breakdown of Syd Barrett early in Pink Floyd's history. And by 1978, the band had become tax exiles from England and needed to create another smash hit to pay off some of their debts. With Waters being the only one contributing concept that were thematically complete, the band voted to work on Bricks in the Wall, expanded it into a double album now known as The Wall. Recording occurred throughout 1979 in France and the United States, although much of the production saw the components from the four band members recorded in isolated sessions throughout the day. Waters was protective of his vision for the album, with Nick Mason and David Gilmour trying to vie for having their input. Richard Wright's contributions were minimal as the Wall story was finalized, and Wright was going through his own divorce at the time. Things came to a head when CBS Records offered a bonus if the band could finish the album for a Thanksgiving release. This meant canceling their vacations, which Wright was unwilling to do, as it was one of the few times he was able to visit his children. Waters delivered an ultimatum to the band. Either Wright was fired, or Waters would release the album as a solo release. Ultimately, Wright decided to quit the band, but was willing to finish his material and wanted to be a part of the final tour. The final album that the band was able to put together has several noteworthy features, including a surprising hit single, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, a sequence where a young Pink imagines what it would have been like for his schoolmates to rebel against their abusive teacher. Originally sounded akin to a number from a spaghetti western, the album's producer, Bob Ezrin, pushed the band to infuse disco into its music, pushing David Gilmour out of his comfort zone to frequent clubs playing disco to familiarize himself with the genre. Although the song denounces a lone teacher and not the entirety of the education system, it has since become a rallying cry for school students across the world. Comfortably Numb is a sequence in the album where Pink is injected with an unknown drug at the discretion of his manager to force him to go on stage. This is a clear allusion to Waters' bout with health scares during the In the Flesh tour of 1977, but it was also inspired a 1967 incident where Syd Barrett was found in a daze backstage, dragged on stage, and was unable to play an instrument. Gilmour and Waters have contention over whose influence was greater in this number. Waters claims the melody and words are all his, with a chord sequence from Gilmour, while the lead guitarist puts it simple that the words are Waters, but the music is his. The final quarter of the album sees Pink hallucinate being a fascist leader. It's been arguably the most controversial aspect of the album, and it can be interpreted in many different ways what this is supposed to mean. I interpret it both as the isolation of the individual, which leads to dehumanization, and the inability to understand what's right or wrong. I also see this as a warning of the power people can give to celebrities, that fans are willing to blindly follow their idols, even if they become immoral. When the album released, it was as successful as the band had hoped. And since its release, the album has sold 30 million copies worldwide. It's second only to Dark Side of the Moon as Pink Floyd's most financially successful release. However, the band's spirits had been shattered. Wright was now gone, and the three remaining band members were isolated. Waters refused to perform the upcoming tour in any stadium-sized venue, not wanting to repeat what had incited the album. The tour was therefore limited to just 4 cities and venues no larger than 20,000 people. Elaborate presentations were featured during the tour, seeing stagehands building a literal wall during the first half of the concert. Free air-powered puppets designed by Gerald Scarfe would fly around the stage during select pieces. Scarfe also produced animation sequences that were projected on the wall itself during the second half of the concert. It was not a concert where the band played its greatest hits, but a multimedia theatrical experience where model planes were crashing into the set, a hotel room was built into the side of the wall, and costumes represent Pink's hallucinations of being a dictator to top it all off. And at the end of the concert, the entire wall would implode upon itself in spectacular but safe manner. However, the lack of mobility of the tour led to the band losing money on this performance, with the only member to profit being Richard Wright, for he was a session musician for this tour. After the end of the tour, Roger Waters went on to assist in a cinematic adaptation of the album, directed by Alan Parker and starring Bob Geldof. The movie saw more input from the producer Bob Ezrin, Gerald Scarfe, and composer Michael Kamen than it did from Waters' own bandmates, though the production itself was a nightmare, and Gilmour and Mason, I'm sure, are happy they were not heavily involved with its production. When Pink Floyd finally went back into the studio to record another album, Gilmour and Mason were frustrated that Waters wanted to use material from Bricks in the Wall that had been deemed unusable. Gilmour was also upset by the strong political stance the new album was taking, being heavily influenced by the Falkland Islands War, which Waters stood against. When the album known as The Final Cut would release in 1983, it did atop the UK charts, but was the most somber-sounding piece the band had ever created. All of the songs were in credit only to Waters. It would mark the final time Roger Waters would be attached to an original piece from Pink Floyd. And in Roger Waters' mindset, Pink Floyd was finished.
I said, well, maybe I would do it. If they ever take the Berlin Wall down, I'll go and do it there as an act of celebration. But it was fraught with problems.
In 1989, the Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief was founded by former British military pilot Leonard Chezier to raise 500 billion pounds to assist victims of future catastrophes, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. Now, in order to promote this new relief fund, Chezier was contacted by certain officials that suggested, let's put on a concert. After all, a few years prior, Live Aid had occurred in 1985, and that was to raise relief for humanitarian efforts. The idea was, let's restage The Wall. Reason being, well, 1989, the Berlin Wall had just been brought down. So, what better way to commemorate the fall of one wall by building another wall? However, Roger Waters was apprehensive to staging the Wall concert again because he believed the Wall was a Pink Floyd product. And in the 1980s, Roger Waters and Pink Floyd, they did not go along very well. There had been a very bad lawsuit over the rights of the band. And ultimately, David Gilmour, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason went off and continued producing new content under the Pink Floyd banner, while Roger Waters staged his own solo concerts, trying to avoid the Pink Floyd moniker. But by the late 1980s, he was reconvinced on this idea because The Wall was largely his idea, his concept. It should be his material to put on whenever he wants to. Now, originally, he'd been considering of restaging the concert on Wall Street, and boy, would that have looked very interesting. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, he decided it'd be perfect to stage it right where the wall once stood. So Roger Waters partnered up with the Memorial Fund, and in 1990, the Wall was coming back for a one-time appearance. They decided they were going to host it on the Potsdamer Platz, which is a rectangular public square that's approximately 25 acres. The problem is this public square had been no man's land for the Berlin Wall for the past 30 years. And to make matters worse, the government of East Germany was a complete mess, so getting work permits to get the necessary materials and manpower to put on this concert took a while to get the permits. It wouldn't be until April of 1990 that they were able to start hiring 600 workers. They only had about 2.5 months to get all the materials to put on this concert. While they were clearing out the Potsdamer Platz, they went in there with some metal detecting work to just double check that there weren't any mines in the region. And funny enough, they unloaded caches of German weapons from the Second World War, including a bunker from the SS. The bunker was then sealed up. Germany's very sensitive about any artifacts relating to Nazi Germany, and you're going to learn very sensitive on any representation on Nazi iconography. Ultimately, they began setting up the stage that would house the new wall. The wall would be 80 feet high, 591 feet long, and made out of 2,500 fire-retardant polystyrene foam bricks on a stage that had 2 road lanes wide enough to support heavy military trucks. Oh, and Waters also decided to reach out to a Soviet military band to provide some orchestral numbers. And there's a story of Waters going way off into the boonies of Eastern Germany. Nobody knew where this Soviet camp was. Everybody kept denying it was a Soviet camp out in this wilderness. And sure enough, they came across it. And yeah, he said they were very malnourished individuals. So a very awkward introduction to bringing one of these elements to the concert into the fold. Now, because of the delays in getting the permits, the concert's date was pushed back several times. Originally, it was going to be staged in late June, but ultimately had to be pushed back to July 21st of 1990. This led to a lot of changes in the lineup. Nevertheless, the concert that was put on would be in front of 250,000 ticketed spectators, although it's believed more than 500,000 people showed up that night. It's one of the largest concerts ever to be hosted. It was broadcasted to at least 35 countries live, with many more getting the tape performance. Interest from the guest performers was mixed. A few couldn't come because they weren't guaranteed when the concert was going to occur. There was also controversy over if Roger Waters had invited Pink Floyd. David Gilmour stated that he did not feel it was right for him to be there. And Waters and Gilmour threw shade at each other throughout 1990, with Waters denouncing a concert that had been taking place in Nebworth just a few weeks prior. Ultimately, notable appearances were by Scorpions, Bryan Adams, Cyndi Lauper, and Van Morrison. The concert was a big visual success, but financially it was not able to make in the bank they were hoping for the relief fund. And after a few years' time, with the death of Lord Cheshire, the memorial fund was folded and the rights to the concert went to Roger Waters.
If that's what the reason for this wall was, then what's it doing in the occupied territories, surrounding settlements and cutting farmers off from their olive trees and so on and so forth?
On June 22nd, 2006, Roger Waters was supposed to stage a part of the Dark Side of the Moon tour in Tel Aviv, Israel, but representatives from Palestine requested Waters see the West Bank barrier. After seeing this barrier, Waters relocated the June 22nd concert to Neve Shalom and denounced the barrier. Now, what does this have to do with the wall is the question. Well, we need to understand a little bit about what this barrier is. The West Bank barrier was established by the Israeli government in response to terrorist attacks perpetrated by Palestinian separatists, in particular during a series of attacks known as the Second Intifada from 2000 through 2005, which claimed the lives of over 1,000 civilians. The barrier was announced in 2003 with plans for 460 miles of the fence along the Green Line. This is the boundary from the end of the 6 Days War in 1967, which was fought between Israel and various Arab nations. That being said, it should be pointed out that the Green Line is not recognized by other international forces as the official Israeli barrier. Much of this barrier was envisioned to be a chain-link fence with barbed wire and ditches, with gates guarded by military personnel that allow passage between Palestine and Israel. 10 miles of it were originally slated to be a concrete wall 30 feet high in highly populated areas to avoid Palestinian sniper fire on Israeli places. As of November of 2022, 62% of this barrier has been completed. Only 15% of it, however, rides in Israel. Its overlap has led to 150 Palestinian communities being cut off, impeding the harvest of oil, which is one of the key goods coming from the West Bank. Approval for applications by Palestinians to pass through the barrier is difficult. Only 58% of these permits were approved in 2016. This means that access to medicine, education, and trade centers in Jerusalem is now impeded on the end of Palestine. Because of this separation between Palestine and Israel, Waters began to denounce Israel on a regular basis, declaring the West Barrier Bank to be something akin to apartheid. And it began to inspire him, along with other events such as the Iraq and Afghanistan wars the United States was involved with. It began to inspire him that maybe the wall should be brought back. And in 2010, Roger Waters would embark on a multi-year solo tour featuring the wall in its entirety with very updated visuals. This included the wall now looking very similar to the graffiti on the West Barrier Bank. The segment for the Thin Ice shows images of loved ones lost to acts of violence, including Eric Fletcher Waters. The sequence for Goodbye Blue Sky features a brand new animation that now shows symbols of what Waters calls various dogma, religious and corporate alike, and controversially included the Star of David, which was retracted early in the tour after criticism. In 2011, Waters added a new piece of music called The Ballad of Jean-Charles de Menezes, which was to pay homage to a Brazilian man that was killed by the London Metropolitan Police. The police misidentified him as the perpetrator behind the 2005 London Underground bombings. Leaked footage of an American airstrike on Baghdad, Iraq, that reportedly led to the deaths of 2 Reuters journalists and injured 2 children was also shown during the concert. The wall's interpretation has now greatly changed. It has gone from being this tale of a rock artist isolating himself to now being an allegory for people being isolated by acts of violence by big corporations and countries. The Wall tour, which went all across the world, was this time financially successful. In fact, up to that point, it was the highest grossing concert tour by a solo act, clocking in $458 million US. The tour also featured appearances by the surviving members of Pink Floyd. David Gilmour appeared at a couple England shows doing his iconic solo Above the Wall for Comfortably Numb, and Nick Mason came out at the end of those concerts playing instruments for Outside the Wall. On April 7th, 2022, David Gilmour and Nick Mason released the first new single under the Pink Floyd title in over 8 years. It features the artist providing instruments to Andrei Klivniuk's rendition of Oh, the Red Viburnum in the Meadow, a song about Ukrainian patriotism that has since been outlawed in Russian-occupied territory during the Russo-Ukraine War. Several members of Gilmour's extended family have ties to Ukraine, which is partly why Gilmour got Mason and some other session musicians together to record this single. When Waters was asked on his perspective of the conflict, he denounced the war, but went on to accuse extreme nationalists within Ukraine of violating a number of terms established by Russia, with Western countries such as the United States encouraging a prolonged conflict for their own benefit. So we have this weird situation where the surviving members of Pink Floyd are all denouncing the war and longing for peace, but are isolated over who should stop firing. Mason and Gilmour want the Russians to stop shooting. Waters wants the Ukrainians to stop shooting. It's weird. It's very weird. Waters has exchanged harsh words over Twitter with the First Lady of Ukraine and has spoken to the United Nations on behalf of Russia, to which Ukrainian officials declared Waters another brick in the wall of Russian propaganda. In September of 2022, the country of Poland canceled a future concert of Roger Waters, and the musician was later declared persona non grata in that country. Then in February of 2023, Polly Sampson, wife of David Gilmour, responded to Roger Waters' tweet about German authorities pushing for a future concert of his to be canceled. Sampson declared Waters an anti-Semite, to which Gilmour supported. It should be noted, since Waters' solo performances of The Wall, he has gone on to show support for the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, a Palestinian-led organization that calls for international sanctions against Israel. Then, to increase this firestorm, in May of 2023, a concert held in Berlin by Roger Waters was investigated by German authorities due to the fact it had Nazi imagery during the sequence of In the Flesh and Run Like Hell. These are 2 songs from the fascist segment of the Wall album. What is so disheartening is they're investigating waters when this sequence has been performed in Germany before, in 1990 at the Berlin Wall, and then in 1981 in Dortmund, Germany, during the original tour of the Wall. In all of those iterations, Waters has dressed in a outfit akin to a fascist. Now, German law is very strict against any symbolism that may suggest something relating to Nazi Germany, but it's pretty easy to tell that Waters is denouncing fascism, is denouncing the actions of Nazi Germany, not encouraging it. So here we are in the summer of 2023. Roger Waters is producing highly political concerts which appear to isolate himself from his former bandmates and the fans of Pink Floyd, in a sense reliving the tale of isolation from the Wall. But it's not so much Waters, Mason, and Gilmore I'm frustrated with, but rather third parties, particularly government officials, misinterpreting or misusing the music from the album. It's an album that's become tied to the Second World War, the end of the Cold War, the conflicts in the Middle East, and now the Russo-Ukraine war, proof that it is a long-lasting message about the negative impacts of war and fame. And I have finished the video. Oh my god, you guys do not realize how many takes I had to do this. It's over. It's over. The Russo-Ukraine stuff was really hard to get through, but I think it's important to tie this story together. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments below. You could tell that I am a major fan of Pink Floyd's The Wall, and I wanted to do a different twist to telling the story of The Wall. I didn't want to do just a standard review of it. I wanted to tell the history, what inspired it, and the historical events it's since been tethered to. Be sure to subscribe to Readout Productions to help grow this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile in support of me, you can buy me a cup of cappuccino. The link is in the description below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.